Why had the valley gone so quiet? Staff Sergeant Jasmine Cooper adjusted the scope pressed against her eye, steady as stone, but something about the silence below made her heart ache in a way she couldn't name. The mountains usually carried sound, echoes of boots on loose rock, the faint clink of metal against metal, sometimes the whisper of foreign voices bouncing across ridges. But now, nothing. Just the dull scrape of wind moving through dry grass and the faint hiss of her own breath against the fabric of her mask. 47 minutes she'd been lying in that same position, her body pressed so flat against the earth that even the ants crawling across her hand barely noticed her. Patience was survival. Stillness was protection. Every muscle, every nerve, every ounce of her weight was devoted to one purpose: wait, measure, and when the time was right, pull the trigger. Her Barrett M82 lay cradled into the rocky outcrop as though it had grown there. 29 pounds of steel, precision, and memory. She knew every scratch, every fine groove of the rifle like a lover's face. The .50 caliber system was heavy enough to break a man's spine if swung, loud enough to punch holes through vehicles, but right now it was an instrument of patience. At 847 meters, her scope drew a perfect bead on 4 enemy soldiers down in the valley. She could see them so clearly it was almost intimate. The way one adjusted the strap of his radio pack, the way another scanned the tree line with lazy confidence, unaware a pair of crosshairs rested over his chest. Jasmine's breathing fell into rhythm: inhale for 4 seconds, hold for 2, exhale slow. Her heartbeat slowed, her trigger finger steady with exactly 3.2 pounds of pressure. Just 0.8 pounds more, and the first man would fall before he even realized he'd been watched. It should have been simple: 4 high-value targets, recon specialists, 1 confirmed sniper, 2 bodyguards. Eliminate them, extract, save dozens of her fellow soldiers from future ambushes. Routine, clean, the kind of job she was made for. But then, cold steel touched the base of her skull. Move and you die. The voice was low, accented, controlled. No tremor of fear, no recklessness of a young recruit. This was a man who knew what he was doing. Jasmine froze. Not her breathing, not her eyes, not even the subtle tension in her finger against the trigger betrayed her. Inside, though, her mind shifted violently from sniper calm to survival calculation. Her heart wanted to race, but she locked it down, pulling oxygen into her lungs like rationed fuel. How had he gotten there? She'd chosen this ridge after hours of movement, careful scouting, and camouflage. A sniper's perch with multiple escape routes, natural cover, and perfect concealment. 3 years of blending into the land, moving like shadow, training her body to be an extension of stone and earth, all of it undone in a single moment. Her throat went dry, not with fear. She'd trained beyond fear. It was something else. Anger, shame. Someone had outplayed her, crept into her blind spot, and made her prey. The words pressed against her pride as much as the rifle pressed against her skull. The soldier behind her didn't move closer. Smart. He kept what he thought was safe distance, 3 meters back, gun leveled. Close enough to kill her instantly, far enough to avoid being disarmed. "Drop the weapon," he ordered, voice unshaken. For a split second Jasmine thought of refusing, of snapping her body around, lashing out with the sheer muscle memory of 100 drills. But survival wasn't about impulse. It was about timing, patience, calculation. The very same skills that had kept her alive as a sniper would now keep her alive as a captive, or a predator disguised as one. She eased her hand from the trigger, sliding the Barrett forward. 29 pounds of steel shifted with deceptive slowness. To him, it looked like surrender. To her, it was repositioning, an anchor, a weapon waiting to be repurposed. "Good," the voice said. "Now turn around slowly, hands where I can see them." Her movements were deliberate, each vertebra turning like the gears of a clock. As her eyes finally met her captor's, she understood immediately. He was no ordinary fighter. His uniform was worn but kept. His eyes calm, not wide with adrenaline. His rifle steady, not wavering with nerves. A professional. "American sniper thinks she hunts," he said with a faint curl of disdain. "Now she becomes prey." Jasmine let him speak, let him fill the silence. That was another lesson. The more they talked, the more they revealed. His tone, his word choice, his confidence, they all painted the profile of a man trained, maybe even seasoned. Dangerous. But he'd made one mistake already. He thought she was helpless. The memories of training came back like a whisper in her bones. The special operations escape and evasion course. The drills where instructors pressed barrels against her head, screamed threats, forced her to adapt under the crushing weight of failure. She had failed back then, over and over, until failure became muscle memory, and muscle memory became reflex. Now, that reflex hummed under her skin like electricity. "Move toward the valley," he commanded, gesturing with the barrel. Her boots pressed into the soil, moving where he pointed. She obeyed with the patience of a snake coiled beneath leaves, every step measured, every rock and shadow in her peripheral vision catalogued. She knew the math already: distance, timing, weapon weight, center of gravity. A fight wasn't about strength, it was about mistakes, and she was waiting for his. They walked 50 meters before he stopped her. "Here, we wait until my comrades finish their mission." Perfect? She masked the thought beneath a blank stare, but inside she felt a cold smile curl. Stationary meant predictability. Predictability meant opportunity. He circled her slightly, weapon always raised. His eyes narrowed as though studying something he couldn't quite reconcile. "You are smaller than I expected," he said finally, "for American sniper." He shook his head with a trace of contempt. How can small women be dangerous to real warriors? The words hit her harder than the steel at her skull. Not because they stung, she'd heard versions of them her entire career, but because they revealed his weakness. Pride, assumption, underestimation. She let silence answer him. Not defiance, not submission, just silence. "Answer me when I speak to you," he snapped, stepping closer, his own pride fraying into anger. Now, the calculation had shifted. 3 meters had become 2. His weapon, once perfectly positioned, now angled slightly off as his focus wavered into insult. His chest open, his throat exposed. Jasmine's body moved before the thought fully formed. Her right hand shot up, deflecting the AK's barrel outward. In the same instant, her elbow slammed into his throat with surgical force. He staggered, choking, just as her knee drove like a hammer into his solar plexus. His air collapsed, his body folding. Her hand stripped the rifle clean from his grip before he even hit the dirt. 1.7 seconds, that was all it took. The man gasped, his chest heaving for breath he couldn't find, his eyes wide in disbelief. He wasn't dead, not yet, but the fight was over. And he realized in those final moments of awareness the mistake he had made. Never underestimate someone who has trained their whole life to be overlooked. Jasmine stood over him, weapon now hers. Her own chest rose and fell, slower than she expected. Calm, controlled, the kind of calm born not of arrogance but necessity. For a moment she just looked at him, the lines in his face, the anger in his eyes, the quiet acknowledgement of defeat. And beneath it she felt something she hadn't expected. Not triumph, not relief, sorrow. Sorrow that it had come to this. That two people trained for survival, shaped by wars neither of them started, had collided in a dance where only one would rise. She breathed in slow, the way she always did before a shot. The valley stretched before her, enemy soldiers still moving in formation, unaware their security element had been broken. The mission had changed. It wasn't 4 targets anymore, not even 12. It was survival. It was silence. It was the chance to prove, once and for all, that the most dangerous weapon wasn't the rifle in her hands but the will in her chest. Why hadn't she noticed him sooner? The question pressed against Jasmine's mind even as her captor lay on the ground, choking and unconscious, his rifle now hers. She replayed the last hour in fragments, the wind shifts, the small valleys she scanned, the rhythm of her breath. She had calculated every detail, every variable, and still he had slipped past her. That single failure was heavier than the Barrett across her shoulder. Failure, the word bit deep. Snipers weren't supposed to fail at awareness. Not once, not ever. She looked down at the man, his chest rising shallowly. He wasn't dead, not yet. She had the power to end him here, a single squeeze of the trigger and no one would question her. An enemy soldier, a trained killer. Leaving him alive carried risk of him waking, shouting, alerting others. But something inside her hesitated. Her thumb rested against the safety of his rifle, feeling the sharp grooves beneath her nail. She could do it. Easy. But his words echoed faintly in her head. How can small woman be dangerous to real warriors? A lifetime of being underestimated, of being dismissed in rooms filled with louder voices, stronger builds, bigger egos. She had learned long ago that silence was sharper than argument, and precision cut deeper than pride. Killing him now wouldn't answer his question, but keeping him alive, bound, gagged, forced to face what she had done, that was the answer. She secured his wrists with cord from her kit, binding tight enough to keep circulation but not enough to kill. A soldier wasn't measured by cruelty, not in her eyes. The radio at his belt crackled faintly. Jasmine froze, crouching low, lifting it to her ear. Foreign words clipped and urgent. 12 voices, 12 different signals. A network of reconnaissance teams spread across the ridgeline feeding positions, plotting American patrol routes. Her chest tightened. 4 enemies in the valley had been the assignment. 12 across the range, that was something else entirely. Her mission had just multiplied threefold. She slung the captured rifle across her back and crawled toward her Barrett. Every step was deliberate, her body melting into the terrain as though stitched to the mountain itself. When her hands wrapped around the familiar grip of her sniper rifle, her pulse slowed again. She was back in her world, back where she belonged. Through the scope, the valley sharpened into focus. The 4 soldiers were still there, oblivious. One bent over a map. Another scanned with binoculars, lazy arcs across the ridge. None of them suspected a ghost had already touched their flank. Her finger found the trigger. But then the memory of the radio struck her like a jolt of cold water. Killing these 4 outright would trigger the silence protocol. The network would notice the broken rhythm. Reinforcements would come. She would be hunted across the ridgeline with nowhere to run. No, she couldn't shoot, not yet. Not until she understood the web they were part of. She withdrew from the scope, exhaling hard. Her chest ached with restraint. Every instinct screamed at her to eliminate them, to take the shot, to end the threat. But patience was survival. And tonight, patience wasn't about the trigger, it was about the silence between shots. The wind shifted slightly, brushing strands of hair across her forehead beneath the ghillie mesh. She pulled them back with gloved fingers, forcing her focus forward. Her training had covered this. Unconventional warfare, elimination without exposure, the art of making death look like accident, malfunction, environment. She remembered the brutal days at Fort Bragg, the instructors dragging them through forests, making them improvise with rope, rocks, even the terrain itself. If your rifle is gone, you are not unarmed. If your plan collapses, you are not defeated. You are only limited by your imagination. She could almost hear her instructor's gravelly voice now. Adapt, Cooper, or die. Jasmine rose slowly, shifting her weight into a crawl. She descended from her perch, each step silent, her ghillie suit whispering against dry weeds. Time slipped into fragments. 10 minutes crawling, pausing for a bird's shadow, 20 more for a cloud's drift across the sun. She became the mountain. She became the silence. By the time she reached the tree line near the valley floor, sweat clung to the base of her spine. Her lips were dry, tongue rough against her teeth. She ignored it all. Every nerve was tuned to sound, to rhythm, to movement. The first soldier was close now, the one with the radio pack. His attention fixed on his map, his boots sinking slightly into soft soil. He had no idea she was only a breath away. Jasmine's eyes caught the faint glint of loose wiring near his pack. A thought formed, quick and clean. She slid her knife free, moved like wind, and with a subtle slice cut the strap on his gear. The radio pack slipped, wires pulling, a spark snapping against the dry grass. He cursed, slapping at it, but the fault spread. Smoke hissed. A pop cracked. Then silence. The man stared, confused, then tugged uselessly at the dead equipment. To his comrades it looked like failure, malfunction, bad wiring. To Jasmine it was the first step. She pulled back, vanishing into brush before their eyes could even search. Minutes bled into an hour. She circled, moving like a ghost between rocks and roots. Each time she appeared, something broke. A canteen that spilled and drew attention at the wrong second. A strap that snapped on a rifle. A loosened rock that tumbled under a boot, twisting an ankle. Tiny moments. Tiny accidents. Each one cutting their confidence thread by thread. The sniper among them cursed loudest. His pride frayed with every mishap, his voice sharp as he barked orders, trying to hold control. Jasmine watched him through narrow branches, her chest heavy with memory. How many times had she been dismissed, underestimated, ignored? And here he was, the reflection of every man who had doubted her, unraveling under pressure. It would be easy to end him, so easy. One pull, one breath, one thunderous shot. But she waited. She wanted him to feel it first, the creeping weight of fear, the realization that he was never in control. By late afternoon, two were limping, one was swearing over his dead radio, and all four were snapping at shadows. They hadn't seen her. They hadn't heard her, but she was everywhere, in the brush, in the silence, in their growing doubt. The unconscious man on the ridge had been right about one thing: hunters could become prey. He just hadn't known how quickly the roles could reverse. As dusk began to settle, Jasmine perched again high above them, rifle steady. The scope framed the sniper's head in perfect symmetry. Her finger pressed against the trigger. But she didn't pull, not yet. She let the crosshairs linger, her chest rising slow, the breath of a predator watching its quarry shiver in the dark. Because tonight wasn't about killing quickly. Tonight was about something far heavier, turning their pride, their confidence, their very assumptions into weapons against them. And somewhere, deep inside, she wondered if she was doing the same to herself. What did fear sound like when it finally cracked a man's voice? Jasmine heard it, faint, brittle, tucked beneath the growl of a seasoned fighter trying to mask his unease. The sniper in the valley barked orders again, but the sharp edge was gone. Every command he gave now carried hesitation. Every glance over his shoulder lingered too long. He knew something was wrong. He just didn't know what. Jasmine lay prone on a ridge above them, her cheek pressed against the cool stock of the Barrett. Through her scope, their faces came alive in fine detail, sweat cutting tracks down their dust-streaked skin, lips moving fast, eyes darting to every shadow. Men who had started the morning as predators were now prey, stumbling through their own paranoia. Her finger hovered over the trigger. The sniper's head filled her scope. One breath, one squeeze, and he'd never speak again. The temptation thrummed through her veins, but she waited, patience, timing. She wasn't just here to kill them. She was here to dismantle them piece by piece, fear by fear. Her mind drifted just for a moment to the unconscious soldier she had left bound on the ridge. He would wake eventually. His throat would ache, his pride worse. Would he tell the truth to his comrades if they found him? Would he admit a woman half his size had turned his weapon against him? The thought pressed at her chest, stirring that strange ache again, not pity, not exactly, but something close. Her radio crackled softly in her ear. She froze, then realized it wasn't hers. It was theirs. She had tuned into their frequency minutes ago, listening. Static hissed, then a voice, a different team, farther downrange. 12 soldiers in total, spread like a net across the mountains. One by one, she had to cut the threads before they knew she was here. The first would be easy. The communications specialist still fumbling with his dead pack. Jasmine steadied her scope. Her heart rate slowed, her breaths timed like metronomes. crosshairs settled on his chest. At 847 meters, the world narrowed to a circle of glass and steel. She squeezed. The rifle bucked, thunder rolling across the valley. A flash of dust leapt from the man's chest, his body folding before his brain even registered death. The others jolted, eyes wide, but Jasmine was already adjusting for the next shot. 4 minutes. That was how long it took before the backup operator picked up his secondary radio. 4 minutes of frantic whispers, desperate adjustments, broken communications. 4 minutes in which Jasmine's scope never left him. When his lips finally moved to transmit, she pulled the trigger. The second body dropped in silence. 2 shots, 2 kills, no transmission. Their network was crumbling and they didn't even understand why. The survivors scattered, diving behind rocks, aiming rifles at shadows that didn't move. They shouted to one another, their words breaking into jagged syllables of fear. Through her scope, Jasmine saw their hands tremble. She had them now. But her chest, it felt heavier than she expected. She had trained for years to make shots like these, cold, precise, efficient. But watching them panic, watching them become human instead of targets, stirred something she hated. They weren't monsters. They were soldiers. Men with orders, men who probably had families waiting somewhere far away. And yet here they were, pawns in a game of silence, and she was the hand removing them from the board. She blinked hard, forcing the thought down. Hesitation killed. Reflection was for later, if later even came. The sniper among them moved suddenly, sprinting from cover. His arrogance still clung to him like a cloak, even as fear clawed at the edges. Jasmine tracked him through her scope, finger tightening. He dove behind a boulder, rolling, peering through his own rifle's scope in search of her. Their eyes almost met, 2 hunters scanning for ghosts. For a heartbeat, she wondered if he could feel her watching him. Her lips parted, breath trembling. She had been underestimated so many times, dismissed in rooms full of men who thought size and gender determined strength. But here, now, her silence was louder than their voices had ever been. She didn't fire, not yet. Instead, she slipped from her perch, moving low along the ridge. Her ghillie suit snagged against thorns, her knees grinding into rock, but she didn't stop. She needed a new angle. A shot from the same place would betray her. Movement was survival. Every muscle screamed with fatigue, but she kept moving. Down through brush, across loose shale, up again onto another outcrop. 30 minutes of crawling for 30 meters. The kind of movement only snipers knew, a war not of speed, but of patience. When she finally set the Barrett into the dirt again, her scope revealed the sniper's back. He was still peering through his rifle, searching in the wrong direction. This was it. Jasmine steadied her breathing. Her finger pressed against the trigger, the steel cold and familiar. She whispered to herself, so softly the wind almost swallowed it. Not underestimated anymore. She squeezed. The shot cracked like thunder. His body jerked, then stilled, face collapsing against his scope. Silence rushed back into the valley. 3 down, 1 left. The final soldier, the last bodyguard, froze, eyes wide, weapon clutched tight. He didn't move, didn't fire, just stood, chest heaving, staring at the fallen men around him. For a moment, Jasmine almost pitied him, almost. But pity had no place here. If he lived, he would radio the others. If he lived, the net would close. She lined her scope on his head, her finger pressed. And then she stopped. Something inside twisted. This man hadn't even raised his rifle. He was frozen, a statue carved from fear. Killing him felt different, too easy, too cruel. She exhaled slow, lowering the scope. Instead of pulling the trigger, she slid back from her position, vanishing into shadow. The soldier would live a little longer, long enough for his silence to confuse the network, long enough for doubt to spread like infection. Sometimes mercy was more powerful than death. As night crept across the mountains, Jasmine retreated higher into the ridgeline. Her muscles ached, Her lips cracked with thirst, but her mind was sharp. 11 enemies still roamed these mountains. 11 voices on the radio, unaware they were being hunted by a single shadow. She thought of the unconscious soldier she had bound. She thought of the 3 she had just killed. And she thought of the one she had spared. The question pulsed through her again, quieter this time, heavier. What was she becoming? A protector, a ghost, or something far colder? The mountain gave no answer, only silence, and in that silence she realized lived both her power and her burden. What did it mean to haunt a battlefield? Jasmine asked herself that as she crouched beneath a twisted pine, night pressing against the mountain like a second skin. She had taken 3 lives today, swift, clinical, necessary. But as the darkness deepened, she wasn't just a sniper anymore. She was something else, something unseen, unheard, but always near. To the men who still walked these ridges, she was Staff Sergeant Jasmine Cooper. She was a shadow, a ghost. The radio she'd captured crackled again. Voices, restless and sharp. They weren't panicked yet, but the threads of confidence were fraying. 2 teams had stopped reporting. One was late on their scheduled check-in. The network was bending under weight it didn't yet understand. Jasmine chewed the inside of her cheek, weighing her options. She could pick them off one by one from distance, but every shot was a lightning strike, a thunderclap that announced her presence. Even with the suppressor, the .50 cal left echoes across the ridges. Too many shots, too fast, and the net would tighten. No, she needed patience. She needed silence. She needed to become the thing they feared most, the accident no one saw coming. Her hand drifted across the pouch on her vest. Inside were the tools no one thought a sniper would carry. A short length of wire, a few trip triggers, 2 smoke charges, a handful of improvised tools she had been taught to trust when the rifle was useless. She could hear her instructor's voice again, harsh and relentless. "You're not a shooter. You're a survivor, a problem solver. You kill with what you have, and what you have is everything." She slid from cover, moving downhill. The moonlight painted the valley silver, every rock and shadow alive with risk. Hours passed as she crawled, climbed, descended. Her world was dirt, stone, breath, heartbeat. She lost track of time. And then she found them. 2 enemy soldiers, sitting near a small fire at the edge of a dry creek bed. Their rifles leaned against stones, their helmets set aside. They were talking in low voices, laughter cutting the silence. For a moment, Jasmine froze, listening. She didn't understand their words, but she recognized the rhythm, 2 men who trusted each other, 2 men who thought they were safe. Her scope could end them in seconds. A single breath, 2 shots, and the fire would have 2 lifeless bodies beside it. But as she watched them, her chest tightened. They looked young, too young, boys almost. She thought of her younger brother, 16, when he begged to enlist, only to be stopped by their mother's tears. She pulled away from the scope, pressing her forehead against the dirt. This wasn't a war fought in abstractions. It was flesh and blood, laughter and fear, lives cut short. And she was the blade. But mercy here meant risk. If she let them live, they would check in. They would report, and the hunt would collapse. Her jaw tightened. She breathed once, twice, and then she moved. Not toward the rifle, not toward a clean shot, toward the creek. She slid along the bank, silent as breath, until she was behind them. Her hand found the trip wire, stretching it low across the path where their rifles leaned. Then, with a deliberate flick, she loosened a rock from the bank. It tumbled into the creek with a sharp clatter. The men jumped, grabbing for their weapons. One lunged forward, tripping on the wire. His body slammed against the other, and in a tangle of limbs and panic, both went down. Their fire scattered sparks into the dirt. One didn't get back up. His head struck a stone with a sickening thud. The other gasped, tried to rise, but Jasmine was already there, her knife at his throat. His eyes widened, fear, confusion, recognition. He didn't fight, he just stared. Jasmine pressed the blade close enough to cut a bead of blood. Then she pulled back. With swift, practiced hands, she gagged him, bound him, dragged him into shadow. Another prisoner, another weight. She looked at the two bodies, one dead by accident, one alive by choice, and she felt the heaviness again, the ache of knowing she had become judge, jury, executioner. The radio at her hip hissed again, voices sharper now, more urgent. The network was cracking. She moved on. For the next 3 hours, Jasmine became silence incarnate. A loose strap cut from a pack, sending gear tumbling down a cliff. A thin rope pulled across a narrow pass, tripping 2 men into a ravine. A smoke charge ignited inside a supply cache, sending panic through another team as they scrambled to douse flames. Each incident claimed lives, some through accident, some through fear, some through her hand pressing blade or pulling trigger when no other choice remained. By dawn, 11 soldiers were gone. Some never even saw her face. Some never knew she existed at all. Only one remained. The man she had bound, the one who had pressed steel against her skull and whispered, "Move and you die." He was still alive, still unconscious when she last saw him, but he wouldn't stay that way forever. He was the last thread in the net, the last witness to what she had done. Jasmine crouched on the ridge above him as the first light painted the mountains. Her body ached, her throat raw with thirst, her hands trembling from exhaustion. But her mind was sharper than it had ever been. She stared at him, the enemy who had underestimated her, who had thought her small frame made her weak. The man whose arrogance had ignited a night of ghosts and shadows. She could kill him now. One squeeze of the trigger, one stone pressed against his skull, it would be clean, final, no risk. But killing him wouldn't erase the truth. It wouldn't undo the way she had been underestimated, dismissed, reduced to something less than what she was. Killing him would only silence him. Letting him live, forcing him to return, to explain to his commanders that a woman had dismantled his entire unit, had turned his arrogance into his downfall. That was the real strike. Her breath shook as she stood. The wind tugged at her ghillie suit, carrying with it the faint smell of dust and smoke. She didn't speak, not to him, not to herself. She just turned and began moving uphill, away from the body, away from the silence, away from the blood. Her radio clicked softly. "Control, this is Ghost 7. Mission complete. 12 eliminated, 1 captured, intel secured." Static, then a voice, calm, respectful. "Ghost 7 outstanding, extraction inbound." The words washed over her, but they didn't fill the hollow in her chest. She had survived. She had won. But as she climbed toward the exfil point, she wondered if victory always had to taste this bitter. Sometimes silence was the loudest sound of all. What happens when the silence finally breaks? Jasmine asked herself that as the helicopter blades whipped the mountain air into a storm around her. She kept her head low, her Barrett slung across her chest, dirt streaked across her face like war paint. The extraction team moved quickly, pulling her aboard, strapping the unconscious prisoner into restraints, sweeping the valley with rifles as if expecting shadows to rise from the rocks. But there were no shadows left. She had erased them all. The cabin roared with noise, but Jasmine sat in silence, her eyes fixed on the floor. The vibration rattled through her bones. The smell of fuel stung her nose, but her thoughts were far away, back on the ridge, back at the fire where laughter had turned to screams, back in the valley where pride had collapsed into panic. 12 enemies gone, 1 captured, not a single shot fired by anyone but her. "You good, Coop?" one of the crew shouted over the engine. His voice was casual, almost congratulatory, as though this were just another mission, another line in the logbook. Jasmine nodded once, a lie. The helicopter lifted her out of the mountains, but it couldn't lift the weight pressing into her chest. She wasn't sure anything could. 3 days later, she sat in a briefing room that smelled of stale coffee and cold steel. Colonel Martinez leaned forward across the table, fingers laced, eyes sharp. Beside him, 2 analysts typed furiously on laptops, capturing every detail she recounted. Maps of the Corin Ridge stretched across the walls, red markers where bodies had been found. "Walk me through it again," Martinez said. His tone wasn't cruel, but it wasn't kind either. It was the voice of a man weighing lives against results. Jasmine's throat was dry. She sipped from the paper cup in front of her, but the water tasted metallic, sour. "They had a network," she began, voice low, steady. 12 men. Communications chain every 30 minutes. Eliminating the 4 in the valley outright would have triggered a silence report. I adapted. Adapted how? She hesitated. The room was too bright, the air too thin. She could still smell the smoke from the small fire in the creek bed, still hear the thud of a skull against stone. Her fingers twitched against the table. "I made it look like accidents," she said finally. "Equipment failures, environmental hazards, traps. I stretched the timeline, removed them one by one until the net collapsed." One of the analysts glanced up, eyes wide. Martinez's jaw tightened. "And you achieved this alone?" Jasmine nodded. Silence stretched. The colonel leaned back, exhaling slow. 12 enemy combatants eliminated. 1 prisoner captured. 0 compromise to your position. You understand, Staff Sergeant, that what you did exceeds every operational parameter in our doctrine." She met his eyes for the first time. Doctrine doesn't breathe. Doctrine doesn't bleed. People do. For a moment the room was still. The analysts paused in their typing. Martinez studied her face, searching for something: guilt, pride, fragility. He found none of them, or maybe he found all of them at once. "Where did you learn this?" he asked at last. Her lips parted, but the answer stuck in her throat. Where had she learned it? In the mud at Fort Bragg, when instructors had broken her down until she stopped thinking like a soldier and started thinking like a survivor. In the silence of rooms where her voice wasn't heard, where she had learned patience, where she had learned that sometimes the sharpest strike was silence itself. In every moment someone had looked at her and seen less strength, less danger, less worth, until she turned that underestimation into her greatest weapon. "Training," she said quietly, "and necessity." Martinez leaned forward again, lowering his voice. "Staff Sergeant, your operation will be incorporated into advanced training curricula. What you did isn't just survival, it's innovation. But I need to know something." Jasmine's heart ticked slower, heavier. "Did it cost you?" he asked. The question caught her off guard. She blinked. "Sir." "Did it cost you here?" He tapped his chest, then his temple. "We ask soldiers to carry burdens no one else can see. Did you come back whole?" The words pressed into her like a knife slipped between ribs. She wanted to say yes. She wanted to believe it. But flashes of the creek fire, the wide eyes of the soldier she'd spared, the choke of the man she'd left bound, they came back too easily. They weren't leaving her. "No one comes back whole," she whispered. The colonel nodded once, as though he had expected that answer. "Then you'll learn to live with the pieces." The debrief ended, but the weight didn't. That night Jasmine lay in her bunk, staring at the ceiling. Around her, the base was alive with sound: boots in hallways, engines humming, voices calling through thin walls. Normal life. But she felt apart from it, as if a glass wall separated her from the rest of the world. She closed her eyes, but instead of sleep, the mountain came back. The silence, the laughter turning to fear, the radio crackling with voices that never got to finish their sentences. She heard them as clearly as if they were standing beside her. Her chest tightened, her breath caught. For the first time since the steel pressed against her skull, she let herself shake, just once, just enough. Because soldiers weren't supposed to feel, but she did, and it scared her more than the bullet that never came. The next morning she stood at formation, her uniform crisp, her boots polished. The metal pin to her chest glinted under the sun. The general's voice carried across the courtyard, praising her for valor, innovation, resilience. Words that felt heavy, like stones laid one by one on her shoulders. The applause came, but Jasmine barely heard it. She looked past the crowd, past the stage, past the banners. Her eyes found the horizon jagged, sharp, endless. The mountains. Because she knew the truth, her war wasn't on the stage. It wasn't in the applause. It was back there in the silence of the ridges, in the weight of choices that metals couldn't lighten. And though the world saw a hero, she felt something else. A ghost carrying pieces of herself that might never fit together again. Why did the silence follow her home? Weeks had passed since the Corin Mountains, but Jasmine still woke in the middle of the night, her breath sharp, her body slick with sweat. The barracks were quiet, rows of bunks lined with sleeping soldiers, but in her head the mountain never slept. She heard the crackle of radios, the sudden thud of bodies, the choking gasp of the man whose throat she had crushed. Sometimes she saw the boy's eyes, the one who had laughed by the fire, who had never even raised his rifle before the accident claimed him. She pressed her palms against her eyes as if darkness could erase darkness, but it never did. By day, she was celebrated. Her name moved like a whisper through the ranks, the sniper who had turned capture into victory, who had dismantled 12 enemies alone. She walked through corridors and felt eyes on her, respect in their gaze. Some even stepped aside to let her pass, as though she were carrying something they couldn't touch. But inside, she didn't feel like a legend. She felt like a fracture, a soldier held together by silence, the cracks spreading wider each time the memories surfaced. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the horizon, Jasmine sat alone on the training range. The smell of gun oil hung in the air, the familiar weight of the Barrett balanced across her lap. Targets stood in neat rows downrange, paper silhouettes waiting for holes to be punched through their chests. She didn't fire, she just stared. Her finger rested against the trigger, but her mind drifted. Every silhouette became a face she remembered. The communications specialist bent over his map, the sniper peering through his scope, the boy at the fire. Even the one she had spared, still bound somewhere in her memory, his silence as heavy as any death. Her chest ached. She whispered to the empty field, "What did I become out there?" The answer was swallowed by the wind. That's when she heard footsteps. "Staff Sergeant Cooper," a voice called, calm, firm. Jasmine looked up. General Patricia Hayes stood a few feet away, her uniform sharp, her eyes sharper. The kind of presence that filled space without effort. She wasn't here by chance. "Ma'am," Jasmine said, rising to attention. At ease, Hayes motioned toward the bench. "Sit, we need to talk." Jasmine lowered herself slowly, her hands folded tight on her lap. Hayes studied her for a long moment, as though weighing more than her words, weighing her soul. "Your operation is all anyone's talking about," Hayes began. "Commanders are already rewriting sections of doctrine because of you. But before we go further, I need to know something. Are you ready for what comes next?" The question twisted in Jasmine's gut. "What comes next, ma'am?" Hayes paced slowly, her boots crunching gravel. "War is changing. More missions will require single operators in denied territory. We can't rely on units for everything. What you did in the Corin Mountains proved one operator, with the right mindset, can achieve more than an entire squad. I want you to help us build that mindset into others." Jasmine's throat tightened. "You mean training?" "Training, development, doctrine. A program that teaches what you embodied: adaptation, innovation, survival." Hayes stopped, fixing her with a look that cut through bone. "But before we ask you to lead others, I need to know you haven't lost yourself." The words lingered like a weight in the air. Jasmine wanted to answer yes. She wanted to stand tall, to embody the unshakable figure others saw when they looked at her. But the silence inside betrayed her. The cracks in her chest whispered the truth. "No one walks away untouched, ma'am," she said softly. "Not from something like that." Hayes nodded slowly. "Good, that's the answer I needed." Jasmine frowned. "Good. You're human, Cooper. If you told me you felt nothing, I'd worry more. This program doesn't need machines. It needs people who understand the weight of choices and still carry them." The general's words struck something deep, something Jasmine hadn't let herself feel: permission. Permission to be haunted and still be worthy. Permission to hurt and still be strong. Hayes continued. You'll be promoted to Sergeant First Class. With it comes responsibility. We'll be sending you to a classified facility. You'll help us design training that pushes operators beyond doctrine. We call it the Advanced Individual Operator Program. Jasmine's breath caught. Promotion. A program. A chance to shape others. It should have felt like triumph. Instead, it felt like another weight settling on her shoulders. That night she lay awake again, staring at the ceiling. Around her, the barracks buzzed with low chatter, laughter, life. But she felt apart from it all. The general's words replayed in her head. It needs people who understand the weight of choices and still carry them. Her eyes drifted shut and the mountains returned. She saw herself crawling through brush, sliding wire across a path, pressing a knife to a throat. She saw the faces of men who had underestimated her, who had feared her, who had died because she refused to be small. And beneath it all, she saw herself, a girl who once stood in a high school gym, too small for the basketball team, too quiet for the debate club, too invisible to be noticed. That invisibility had become her armor. That silence had become her weapon. Now it was her curse. The next morning she stood before a mirror, her uniform pressed, her new rank stitched against her chest. She studied the reflection. The woman staring back looked unbreakable, but behind her eyes shadows lingered. She whispered to her reflection as if reminding herself, "Carry it, don't let it carry you." The mirror didn't answer. It never did. Days later, she boarded a transport bound for the classified facility Hayes had mentioned. The air inside smelled of leather and steel. The men around her spoke in low tones, but she kept to herself, her hands folded, her eyes closed. The mountain was gone, the applause was gone, but the silence had followed, it always would. She wondered, not for the first time, if she would ever feel whole again. But maybe that wasn't the point. Maybe survival wasn't about being whole. Maybe it was about carrying the broken pieces with dignity. And sometimes dignity didn't speak, it simply acted. What did it mean to teach others how to haunt? Jasmine asked herself that the first morning she stood before her class. 12 faces stared back at her in the cold concrete hall of the facility. Men and women pulled from special operations units across the country, each with medals pinned to their files and pride stitched into their shoulders. They were soldiers who thought they knew endurance, patience, and pain. They didn't know silence, not yet. Jasmine's uniform carried her new rank, Sergeant First Class. The insignia felt heavier than the Barrett ever had. She cleared her throat, the sound echoing against the bare walls. "You've been chosen," she began, her voice low but steady. "Not because you're the strongest, not because you're the fastest. You're here because someone thinks you can survive what others can't. I'm here to find out if they're right." The students shifted in their seats, eyes narrowing. One man in the front row smirked faintly, arms crossed. She saw the pride in him, the same pride she'd seen in the enemy sniper who thought strength was louder than patience. Her gaze cut to him. "You think this will be like your other training, push-ups, sprints, live-fire drills? It won't. You'll fail here if you think you can muscle through. Because when the mountain takes your breath, when silence is your only weapon, when every voice in your head screams at you to quit, the only thing left will be who you are when no one's watching." The smirk vanished. The room went still. She let silence stretch, pressing down on them, testing them. Then she spoke again, softer this time. "Some of you won't make it through. That's not failure. That's truth. Not everyone is meant to become a ghost." The training began that afternoon. They started in the forest surrounding the facility. Jasmine led them into the trees, their packs heavy, their faces determined. The sun sank low and she gave them their first assignment: vanish. "You have 48 hours, she said, her eyes scanning their ranks. "Stay unseen, stay unheard, live off what you find. If I catch you, you fail." One of the women raised her hand. "Sergeant, what's the objective?" Jasmine's lips tightened. The objective is to survive being hunted by me. Confusion flickered across their faces. Some tried to mask it with bravado. Others tightened their grips on their rifles. But Jasmine knew what was coming. She had been where they stood. She knew how arrogance crumbled when hunger set in, how confidence collapsed when shadows whispered louder than orders. For 2 days she hunted them. Her boots pressed against damp earth, her ghillie suit blending with the brush. She moved silent, patient, watching. One by one they made mistakes, a snapped twig, a careless fire, a breath too loud. The first she caught was the smirker. He crouched in a clearing, rifle slung lazy, confidence still written across his face. Jasmine slipped behind him, blade at his throat before he even realized she was there. "Lesson 1, she whispered in his ear. "Pride is loud, loud gets you killed." He froze, his chest heaving, realization dawning. She bound him, left him in a marked zone for extraction. Another ghost in the making, or another casualty of arrogance. Time would tell. The second was a woman who had hidden well but let hunger drive her into risk. She had tried to raid a supply cache too soon, leaving signs in the dirt. Jasmine tracked her trail, cut it off, and cornered her. "Lesson 2, she said quietly. "Patience feeds you longer than hunger ever will." By the end of 48 hours, half the class had failed. Some sat in the extraction zone with eyes lowered, shame pressing heavy on their shoulders. Others returned scratched and exhausted, their pride chipped, their silence deeper. Jasmine stood before them again, her voice steady but her chest tight. "This isn't about being perfect. It's about being invisible when perfection isn't possible. It's about learning that survival isn't loud and excellence isn't always noticed." The words echoed in the hall, but she wasn't just speaking to them. She was speaking to herself. At night, when the students slept in the barracks, Jasmine walked alone through the empty halls. Her boots echoed against concrete, the sound almost accusing. She thought of the mountains again, of the way silence had followed her home. Now she was teaching others to carry it. Did that make her stronger, or did it make her cruel? One night she found herself back on the training range. The Barrett rested in her arms, its weight both comfort and burden. She aimed at a paper silhouette, but her vision blurred. She saw the boy at the fire again. She saw the wide eyes of the soldier she had spared. She saw the cracks in her own reflection. She lowered the rifle. For the first time, she admitted aloud what she had never said in the debrief, never whispered to anyone. "I'm afraid." The word lingered in the cold air, fragile but real. Afraid of the silence, afraid of the memories, afraid that by teaching others to haunt, she was spreading her own ghosts into them. The next morning, during a navigation drill, one of the younger soldiers stumbled, panic in his eyes as he realized he was lost. Jasmine approached, kneeling beside him, her voice calm. "Breathe, listen. The forest speaks if you let it. Don't fight the silence, use it." The soldier nodded shakily, steadying his breath. For the first time, Jasmine saw not just fear in a trainee's eyes, but trust. That night, she thought of Hayes's words. It needs people who understand the weight of choices and still carry them. Maybe that was her role now, not to erase the silence, not to escape it, but to teach others how to bear it. She stood once more before her class, her voice steady, her eyes hard but not cold. "Everything you've learned before brought you here, but what I teach you now will take you past those limits. You're here to discover what you are when everything else is stripped away. You'll hate me for it. You'll hate yourselves for it, but if you make it through, you won't just be soldiers. You'll be ghosts, and ghosts are never underestimated." Their faces were tired, their bodies bruised, but something flickered in their eyes, resolve. And for the first time since the mountains, Jasmine felt a spark inside her chest. Not peace, not healing, but purpose. What becomes of a ghost when the world starts to believe in it? Jasmine asked herself that as she stood on the stage 2 years after the mountains. The auditorium was filled with uniforms, generals, commanders, instructors, foreign officers who had traveled across oceans to hear her speak. Behind her, a banner displayed words that made her skin crawl: the Cooper method. She had never wanted her name attached to anything. She had wanted to disappear, to be unseen, to carry her silence without witness. But here she was not invisible anymore, not underestimated anymore. The ghost had become doctrine. Her chest tightened as she adjusted the microphone. She could feel the weight of 1,000 eyes. For a moment her throat threatened to close, but then she remembered the mountains, the silence, the way fear had taught her to move even when her body begged to stop. She breathed once, twice, and then she spoke. "Some of you know my story," she began, her voice steady though her hands trembled behind the podium. "You know the numbers: 12 enemies, 1 prisoner, a mission that should have ended in failure but didn't. That's what's in the files, that's what gets studied, but numbers don't tell the truth." The room hushed. She let silence stretch. "The truth is, I was afraid of being captured, afraid of failing my mission, afraid that maybe everyone who doubted me was right. Fear was the only constant in those mountains, and what I learned is this: fear doesn't make you weak. Fear sharpens you. Fear teaches you patience. Fear teaches you silence." She scanned the faces, some skeptical, some moved, some unreadable. "I wasn't stronger than the men I faced. I wasn't faster. I wasn't louder. I survived because I listened when others shouted. I waited when others rushed. I let them underestimate me, and then I turned that underestimation into my weapon. That's what I teach now. Not how to shoot straighter, not how to fight harder, how to carry silence, how to let it work for you." Her words hung in the air, heavy, deliberate. She could feel the ripple they left. After the speech, she walked off stage, her chest hollow. Applause thundered behind her, but she barely heard it. Recognition never filled the silence. It only echoed louder. Later that night, she sat alone outside the facility. The air was cool, the sky endless. Crickets hummed softly in the grass. For the first time in weeks, she felt something close to calm. Her mind drifted to the faces of her trainees, the ones who made it through and the ones who didn't. Some had broken in the silence. Some had thrived. She had seen pride crumble, fear blossom, and resolve harden into steel. She had seen in them the same cracks she carried in herself. Maybe that was the point: not to be whole, not to be unbroken, but to carry the fractures with purpose. Her phone buzzed. A message from Hayes. "Outstanding speech. The Allies want the program shared. Your methods are changing more than our own doctrine. They're shaping the future." Jasmine read it, then set the phone aside. She wasn't sure how she felt about shaping futures, but she knew this much: she would never let anyone believe ghosts were born of glory. Ghosts were born of silence. She leaned back against the bench, staring at the stars. The mountains lived in her still: the firelight, the crack of rifles, the fear in men's eyes, the silence that followed. She would never leave them behind, but maybe she wasn't meant to. Sometimes memory was the heaviest weapon a soldier carried, and sometimes dignity wasn't loud. It didn't boast, it didn't demand recognition. It simply acted. She closed her eyes, and for once, the silence inside her felt less like a burden and more like a companion, a reminder of who she had been and who she had become. And somewhere in a file locked deep in a vault, stamped classified, the story of Staff Sergeant Jasmine Cooper was written in words that few would ever read. She was aiming at enemy soldiers. Then an enemy behind her whispered, "Drop your sniper." What followed was the deadliest reversal in modern warfare. But Jasmine didn't need the files. She didn't need the medals. She didn't need the doctrine. She had learned her own truth. The most dangerous weapon wasn't the rifle in her hands or the training in her body. It was the silence she carried and the will to never let it break her. And in that silence she finally found a kind of peace. Not wholeness, not glory, but dignity. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts.